going to be using white gouache, watercolors, a flat and a round, and then of course my HB pencil, and we're going to do a couple color studies today. And these color studies are, I've just picked a couple different images here so that we could kind of look at them from, say, a standpoint of doing concept art or illustration, where we're looking for a subject matter and then we're trying to fine-tune the color system that we're going to be painting with. So I've chosen a military image, and then I've also chosen a city scene, a street in Europe somewhere. And together the two of them show some complexity, but I don't want you to think about them as complex. I want you to just think about them as trying to find the shapes and then trying to find the correct color and the temperature within those shapes. So I start with a crude pencil sketch, just something that gets me started, some place to begin, and I don't get too caught up in accuracy with this because it's just a study. We don't have to worry so much about the details and the proportions and the logic behind all of the sharp versus soft edges. This is more of just a color study. The colors that I'm using, I have a Naples yellow, I have a yellow ochre, I have the white that comes from gouache, so it's permanent white. I have a burnt umber. I have two different greens. One of them is an olive green, and the other one is this chartreuse color. I don't remember the name of it right offhand. I think it's permanent green light. An ultramarine blue, and alizarin crimson, and then black. Yes, black is included in this. Black is a good color. It's your shader, where white is your tinter. So you need to actually have a black if you're going to try and reduce certain colors down in value. We start with a wash, a general wash, and I'm working on Xerox paper here to show that you don't need the tricky paper either. The thing to remember here, though, is that I don't use a lot of water. If I use a lot of water, then all of a sudden the paper is going to buckle all over the place, and the paper did buckle a little bit when I was painting these, and you'll see that in the sky plane. When I go to put some color down within it, sometimes it stripes or it bands a little bit. What I'm looking for are the temperatures. So a cloudy sky tends to be a filtered sky, and those clouds acting as filters, especially when they're thinner, are going to show the color of the light source through most of their light spaces. And as the colors get darker in the sky, those tend to lean towards the sky color, the blue colors. So warm where the light comes through, and cool where there is very little light passing through. The ground has been warmed up. Both the green and the yellow that represents the weeds in the ground are both warm colors. The green has a bit of yellow orange in it so that it warms it up, making it feel like it's lit by the sky. And now I'm going to come back into the cooler spaces and use the blue sky to cool off the shadows within the trees or bushes or whatever it is that's back there that's creating the different shapes. Again, remember, it's not so much about these trees need to be very specific to what they are. It's more about there's light and shade within this green space. How do I get the light and the shade to feel right? And you can see also when I go into these deeper pockets, I'm cooling them off even further. I'm making more of a purple color, and those are the deepest shadows in there. And the tendency with those shadows is that it's obviously the coldest space possible, the occlusions, or where very little light travels into, as well as in terms of temperature. There's many different things interacting. There's the bounce light coming from the ground, the dead foliage, the branches of the tree, and all of that stuff together kind of creates a slight purple effect. Now on the ground plane, I'm going to put a few marks that indicate the cast shadow from the helicopter up above, and just a few surface delineations to break up the space so it's not just a flat tone. As you can see, everything else in the sky is a little more developed, as well in the trees. It's a little more developed, and I don't want the ground plane to feel like the only thing completely unfinished. I'll come back to that later and address a little more light on that surface, but for right now, the yellow wash suffices and the shadow works okay. So now that I have the background in and that it has dried, I'm going into the helicopter shapes and I'm blocking out their shadows. Darks first, lights second, basically is how it wants to work. And in the case of the background, it was more about a wash first and then developing the shapes on top of the wash, trying to get their local colors established first and then painting the shadows on top. So it's kind of a reverse order now in where I'm going. Now the flat is good for a lot of different things. As you see, I've been using it pretty much the entire time. It's good for using the broadside to lay in big general washes, and it's also good on its edge to create nice sharp shapes. So anything architectural or man-made work really well with this kind of brush. Now I'm switching over to the round because there's a lot of little tiny shapes within I switched right back. Okay, so I'm going to be switching to a round here to put the little tiny shapes into it. But I still need a few general planes blocked out before I get started with all those little tiny shapes. So I'm also thinking about larger shapes to smaller shapes. And the one thing I was competing with in this demonstration was all the bright lights. I forgot that when you add water to a surface, it tends to have a lot of reflectivity to it. So I didn't notice the actual value of some of these colors I'm painting until the water kind of dried up. And then I was able to look at the surface for what it was. So I will be going over a few of these shapes a few times just to increase their value and get them to pop a little more off of the surface. Many of the colors that I'm using right now on the helicopters are very similar to the colors in the sky. Rightly so. That's the camouflage color that they were trying to be. And I did really well by camouflaging the helicopters, but in order for them to stand out in the way that they do in the photograph where the bright light is hitting them, they needed to be a little more reflective. So the sharp shapes. Now when building these props on the helicopter's top side, I need a nice confident hand to be able to pull a long line. And in some cases where the props were a little wider, it's okay to use short choppy strokes as I've done here. But once I get started on a couple of the other blades, they're going to be as precise as I can make them. But given that I'm doing an opaque approach here, it's really easy to go back into the background color and cut back into them. So now I've switched over to the round brush and I'm futzing with the little things, as it were. But again, to try and stay away from too much tedium of exactness, I'm being very quick and spontaneous about the shapes. And knowing that I'm working with a brush that has a nice point to it, or at least in this case has a point to it, it helps me tap in little tiny spots without getting caught up in what those spots actually are. A good approach to this too, if you're going to work off of the computer screen, is to shrink your image down as small as you can make it so it's just a thumbnail, or push the monitor back as far as you can from your eyes so that you don't end up getting caught up in all of the little details. It's very easy to do that, to fall into the trap of needing to paint details. And like any good painting, we want to go from big to small. The big surfaces first, and then work our way down to the small surfaces. So the other thing that I'm really concerned with is the differences in temperature. There's a lot of planes on these helicopters, or surfaces on these helicopters, that are facing the blue sky. The sun is behind them, so a lot of the forward lighting is going to be lit from the skylight. And here are those brush strokes that I was talking about, where you just want to be really confident about how you pull the strokes. That one in particular I'm going to go back in and correct because it didn't quite hit the mark that I was shooting for, but it came very close, so I'm not that far off to where I have to destroy the brush stroke and start all over again. Here's that next pass at the light planes. I'm lighting them up, or lightening them a little bit further than what I started with. But again, I will go back over them later. This is just one more pass at pushing things brighter and darker. Also, I'm working light shapes against dark shapes. So that's the other tool that I'm working with to help separate one from the other and make things more visible, even though they do share very similar values and very similar temperatures. If you'll also notice, I'm wiping my brush after almost every color that I put into the surface. That way the color isn't still sitting in the brush, and that's what I call a color surprise. When you go to mix a color and then you go to put the color into the picture space, and all of a sudden it's a totally different temperature than when you were expecting, because all those other colors are settled into the brush. When I'm working with the darks, it doesn't matter as much as when I'm working in the light spaces. It's obviously more critical when you're working with the lights than with the darks. Darks can have multiple references illuminating them, because darks are illuminated. And yet at the same time, It doesn't really matter which temperature is coming off of the brush more than the one that you really need to use at that time, because it's really just about judging the light things versus the dark things. Adjusting the temperature is very easy to do after the fact. It's getting the value right and getting things to read that's more important. Alright, so now I'm going back in with a flat brush, and I'm using just the corner of the brush to spot some of these little light spaces, and to go back in and cut into some of the other shapes that I might have put in the wrong space or made a little too large. So although I'm not concerned with every little nuance and detail, I am sort of concerned with the scale of the shapes that I'm painting as I go. So now I'm spotting some of the darks, and I'm going into the umber color to do that, mostly because in the forward planes of this object, or the forward surfaces, they're illuminated by the blue sky, which means there's going to be warmer shadows. And yet at the same time, the overall effect is the sun is hitting this object, so that would mean warm light and cool shadows. But there's a constant juxtaposition happening when you're outside. It's why outdoor painting is so difficult, because while we have rules established in so many different areas of art, when you go outside, sometimes you almost have to throw all those rules out and just go with what you see, so long as you are governed by some of the rules that help you get where you need to go. Now, I'm almost done with this one here. I've just got a few more things to touch up upon. And the best thing to do for any picture that you make is to go back in and make a nice solid frame around it. So here I've taken a Sharpie to block out the edges, and once that frame is put in, everything kind of snaps into place and you can see what is missing. And here I'm going to go back into the sky and light things up a little bit. I'm going to go into a couple of the surfaces on the helicopters and light them up a little bit more, because I noticed that things are a little too dark overall. And then I'm going to go into the ground plane, and I'm going to bring in one more color down there, because I feel like the ground is just a little too yellow overall, and I think it could use another pass of something even brighter. One other thing I'm doing is I'm going around into the trees and I'm pushing their chroma, or more color, so that they have a little more color vibrancy against the gray objects that are the focus within the picture. As you can see, I'm just using the green right out of the tube, but as a wash, it serves as a really nice color base. As long as I don't go too opaque, that wash will do just fine, and you'll still see the original shapes through that you had already painted. I'm warming up the underside of the helicopter a little more, because the ground plane is bouncing some of that nice yellow light up into it. And then here's that last color that I'm going to project into the ground plane. I'm making a kind of a reddish hue, and those are the colors that go off into the distance. Yellowers up close, yellow colors up close, then orangey colors, and then reddish colors in the distance. And that really does make a difference in the ground plane, keeping it warm, but at the same time separating the trees from the absolute ground plane and giving it a little bit more color warmth, so that it does appear as though the sunlight is hitting it. Now overall, this quick sketch probably took about 32 to 34 minutes altogether, and like I wrote in the very beginning of the video, it's sped up 200% so that you're not watching the entire 32-minute video. Plus I wanted to add a second video to this, so I needed to speed things up a little bit. That way you can see both of them together at the same time. This next subject is a city street, or an alleyway rather, with a number of little shops in it and a bunch of complex looking buildings. But if we don't think about what they are, and we just look at them as geometry, simple shapes, whether they're primitives that are easy to recognize or they're something that looks like a puzzle piece, that's all you need to think about. If you start getting caught up in this is a person and I need to know how to paint people, or this is a window so therefore it needs to be perfectly square, then you're going to run into a number of problems with getting a quick sketch finished, because the quick sketch is not about exactness. It's more about whatever you label it to be that you're looking for. And in this case, I'm looking for a color study. I'm looking for the shapes and I'm looking for their colors. And the colors in this painting represent the temperature of the light and the local colors of the objects and how the light influences those objects. So I begin again with some washes, and I start in the sky, and I could very well have painted that sky color into the shaded side of this alleyway, which I think I should have done, but I'm mixing a second color instead, which is also cooled off. You can see I dragged some of that blue into it, which took the bite off of the yellow, making it feel warm. And I'm starting with all of the heavy-duty shaded spaces first, and then I'm going to approach the lights, which is a common way of working, especially when you're on a white surface, to start dark and then go to light. And the purpose for doing that is that your white paper is already light. That's the extreme end of one half of the value scale, and what we're looking for now is the other half, the dark end of it. So in terms of what I'm looking for, it's the other end of the value scale. And then within the temperature setting, we have a warm light source, so a lot of our shadows are going to be cool. Now, these are yellowish buildings, and you'd say, yellow is warm, why wouldn't you cool it off? Or why are you painting yellow things when you're talking about cool? Well, with the blue added and the black added to yellow, it drops its color to a greenish hue. Anytime you darken yellow, it's going to green, or it is going to look more greenish in hue than it is yellow, which is just basically saying we've darkened the yellow. As long as the context is there within the light and the shadows, the yellow should come across even within the shadows. So I had to clean my palette off there because I needed more space for some of these warmer colors that I'm going to be mixing. Now, another thing that I'm doing here is as the buildings climb into the sky and they're lit by the light sources, two of them, the sky and the sun, I'm cooling the building off a little bit. You can see that there's a bit of a bluish hue up top on the closer buildings, and that's to show the influence of the sky as well as the sun, because you have elevations, so the temperature is going to change. What is immediate to our eye will have more local color effect, and as it pushes away, atmosphere sets in, and that atmosphere kind of convolutes the local color, changing its temperature a little bit and sometimes its value. Now, this alleyway has a bit of distance to it, but in the end, when looking at the image, you can see that there's also some clarity within the shapes. It isn't so far away like a mountain range that we have to completely change the value relationships between the light and the darks too much, or in too extreme a way. However, in the end, I do wish I had lightened up the windows in the background just a little bit more to show off that it is a bit further in the distance. But anyway, moving back into the foreground, I need more variation in temperature. As you can see from the reference, there's a few more colors in there than just yellow. And I also need to darken the value a bit more to show off that it is in the shade. And at this stage, you can see that one side is lit from the light and that the other side looks like it's in shadow because the value has dropped considerably. I would say that they're about 2 values off from each other. There's reflected light coming from these lighter buildings on the right-hand side, and they are going to illuminate the shadows. So it's not like I'm totally blocking out the shadows altogether. It's that I'm trying to find a color that comes close to what I see with my eyes. But I'm still thinking about them in terms of light and shade. So now I'm going into the shadows because I have most of the local surfaces established, and what I'm looking for is some of the darker occlusions within those shadow spaces. Anything that has more distance to it within certain pockets, and then other places that are just influenced by a really dark space. But it isn't pure black. Any of these darks that I'm putting into the picture are actually colored darks. I'm using black to help me tone or shade them down a little bit, but I'm not using black straight out of the tube. It wouldn't make any sense, because if a surface is lit both by indirect and direct light, there isn't going to be any real black in it. Even at night, you'd be surprised. There are no real blacks. It's just a different temperature relationship between whatever the direct light source is. Even if it's the moonlight or the stars illuminating a space, you're still going to have some kind of temperature relationship between the shadows and the lights. And that has to do with our eyes and how our eyes work. Our eyes automatically shift the temperatures from each other. The world may actually be that way, but it's in our eyes that we see all of this stuff. So we relate it to more of our physiology than we do the atmosphere and the space. Now, again, what I was saying about the windows, don't get too caught up in making them perfectly square. What we're looking for is a representation of color and shape. And these colors should just be cooler in these shadows than brown and warm like some of the darker things that we're going to put into the direct light source. I'm also not getting caught up in counting windows or how many different spaces there are. I'm more concerned with the general, the overall, and how the overall feels together. Because if I'm going to use something like this picture for another purpose, like in concept art, maybe borrowing these color temperatures for my own imagined city, all I'm looking for is relationships here, and that's really the most important thing out of this study. But using a flat brush will help me at least create an effective architectural design, more than if I were to use the round, where I would have to work harder to get some sharper edges or some square looking shapes within those spaces. The other nice thing about this flat is that it covers a lot of space very quickly, and so I'm not sitting there niggling away at the little tiny things, putting in a lot of paint and trying to progressively move it around. It's just basically laying the brush down on the surface, dragging it a little bit, and I have the whole space worked out. I'm also not caught up with the perspective. Again, that's not for this particular kind of image. If it were a finish, I might be more concerned about that, and that also depends upon the direction that I'm taking that finish. If it's more abstract, then I may not concern myself at all with the perspective, but if it is a representational scene, then I certainly need to be mindful of the perspective, and I'd probably work out on the horizon lines some areas that I can aim most of the edge lines to in order for the perspective to stay solid. But in this case, it's more about getting things to look lit and getting things to look like they're in shadows. So as you can see with the smaller windows, I'm still using the same size flat. I'm just squeezing down the brush hairs a little bit to get it to fit into those spaces so that they do recede. It's not a full half-inch brush anymore. It's being squeezed down closer to a quarter-inch brush. And although the hairs might curve just a little bit, I'm still not concerned with being exact about the square shapes. I'm more concerned about getting the representation of the color space within those shapes. Now I'm working on the underplanes of all of these different balconies, and they do have a little bit of bounce light in them coming from the walls, and also though I'm more concerned with getting them to look cooler than the rest of the wall surrounding them looks warmer. I'm still considering that temperature space more than anything else. Now, a lot of the other things that I'm going to be doing in the shadows will bring back some local colors and vary the shapes a little bit, like those radar dishes up towards the top of the building. And so I can use this round to help me plot some of those. The round is good for lots of little tiny spaces that have more of an organic shape to them, so that they differ just enough from all of the more rectilinear shapes. And it gives a little bit more variety. But I revert to this brush after I've already laid in all the bigger spaces. And you can see I'm saving the bottom for later because it's made up of lots of organic shapes. It's in the shape design that I'm going to fill that space. I'm more concerned at this point with getting everything up in the buildings taken care of, because this is, especially in a cityscape, this is where we tend to spend most of our time trying to get the architecture to actually read like architecture. The figures are organic shapes, and that'll be easy to block in later on. So now the topmost spaces, I'm looking for the ledges, and I'm looking for the bottom edges of some of these windows, any of the details like those little ripples on the awning. Anything small I can now go ahead and put in. Before, though, it was more about blocking the big shapes in. So again, like I mentioned in the first demonstration, large shapes to small shapes. And then as I get into the small shapes, I can start getting smaller within them, which just basically means looking for the temperature variations within each of these little spaces. I'm also going to mention one more time that because I am working with so many different hues and one brush, that I'm wiping the brush thoroughly between each color block that I put in there. When the brush goes off screen, I'm wiping it out with the paper towel. All right, now that I have all of the bigger parts in the picture, I'm going in to block in some of these figures. And I'm doing it the same way. Since this is an opaque approach, I'm layering. I'm looking at the value bases first. How dark are each of these figures within this picture space? And then I'll go back in afterwards and I'll look for the lighter values. So some of these people are wearing colored shirts. I'm looking for the blue hues, and I'm looking for the reds that are cooled off, and I'm blocking those out as I go because those really don't need a blackish hue underneath them. If I get the value correct and I get the temperature somewhat close, they should represent figures within the darkened spaces. So now I have this kind of reddish color, which represents the skin tones within this darker foreground. And as well, I can use it for some of the other colors, like some of the shirts in the background as they move off into the distance. Also, you can see that the building in the background has dark looking windows in it, but because of all the bigger, darker shapes that I'm pushing in the foreground, they are scaled different. They're scaled differently, and they sit further back in space, so they don't really compete too much with the foreground. But I do wish that I had put them in just a little bit lighter. It would have shown a little more atmosphere in the picture space. But all those windows were also sort of shaded, or they were dark portals on a side that's not directly facing the sunlight. Each of those buildings is starting to curve around the corner. But that's no excuse. I could have still lightened them up a little bit more. Alright, so now I'm going in and I'm putting in some of the railings on the balconies. And after I'm done doing that, I'm going to go around and clean up a few shapes just to reorganize some of my thoughts. Where I might have made something a little bit too organic looking, I can always go back in now and clean things up. With the paint being opaque, and as long as I'm not using a yellow, which is semi-transparent, I should be able to cover up a lot of the mistakes or a lot of the areas that I deem mistakes, just to help reorganize my thoughts again. At this point, I'm putting in a slightly warmer shadow pattern underneath in spaces where there's some sunlight showing through, like on that white diagonal that represents an awning. There's going to be a little bit of sunlight that kind of blasts through there, and it illuminates the space because there's light passing through it, and a warm light because the sun is a warm light source. And then all of the smaller knickknacks, all of the little tiny cast shadows, that shutter that's in the light, I'm changing the temperature of it a bit so that there's a dark and a light next to each other. Any little cuts that are between the walls, any small ledges, the little things. And I'm using the round to do that because it's like a pencil with its point on it, and I can go in there and be very meticulous about all the little line strokes that I'm putting in. As well as the tops of the buildings, I don't need to be too careful with them when I'm first laying them in, because I can always go back in and cut back into their edges. Now, if this was a transparent watercolor painting, then I would be more concerned about how I lay things in. But I'm using these out of the tube opaque and not as the cakes. I myself am not partial to painting with the cakes. I like the out of the tube watercolors. My first water medium was acrylics, and then I learned gouache. Watercolor came later for me, and since I learned that there were tube paints as well as the cake paints, I picked up on that, and I painted like watercolorists do with a lot of the transparent effects with both gouache and watercolor, and I'll go back and forth between the two techniques. But for color studies, I really love nice, rich, opaque colors, and so that's why I'm kind of showing you this. Watercolor doesn't need to be transparent in the way that we think of it, especially since the name is watercolor. We tend to think that we need to use a lot of water to make it feel that way, but the fact is that watercolor can be just as opaque as anything else, especially when it comes out of the tube and it's thick and viscous. It actually works as a really nice medium in its thickened state and its opaque state. It also dries the same color value as when it's wet. It just loses reflectivity, and that's the water that shines back. And that was one of the things I mentioned earlier that I was having a bit of difficulty with. When the water was on the surface, it's a little bit harder for me to see the true value color of something because the water is creating a reflective plane. or something that looks more like a mirror. And then once that water dries, I can actually see what my mistakes were in the value or in the temperature. And that's kind of what I'm doing now, is I'm going back in and adding gradients, and or I'm adjusting certain values to get them back to the value that they should be. Now, like I mentioned earlier also, I wish I had made some of those background shapes just a tiny bit lighter so that they recede back into space, but that's also why I'm kind of shrinking them in scale. I'm reducing them down in size so that they don't jump forward as much. And I think with my picture frame on it, it's going to make a difference also in how I perceive all of those color values. Now I'm going back in and warming the sky up because there's a certain haze to it, but I started with a little too much red in there. So I went back in and found my white tube of paint, applied some more to the palette since I was running low. And that's something else to remember. When you run low on any kind of color, make sure that you refill it, even if it's at the very end of a painting, because you don't want to find a cheap substitute. That's when the picture starts to break down, when you get a little sloppy. I'm going to be finishing this picture quickly, but I'm still going to replenish my colors as I start to lose them on the palette, because I do need them to help finish this off. Now we come in with the frame. We frame all of the shapes to kind of see what we have within the picture space, and that helps us make any more like secondary decisions on what to fix. And in this case, I noticed a few things that I need to go back in and adjust. I needed to go back into the background and reduce the amount of lightness down below, because there's a number of awnings casting shadows onto the walls. And I realized that in the foreground, there's a lot of little knick-knacky shapes that have different colors to them that I needed to put in. So I'm making sure that the values are accurate. And when I put them into those shaded spaces, that they contribute to the darkness within that space. I'm also noticing there's a lot of lines everywhere down below that repeat too often, and so I'm going back in with some more figures and covering some of those up just to help make the space feel more natural and not someplace that your eye will automatically start with because of its repetitive nature. Anything like that we can call a tangent, or a space that we don't want the eye necessarily to go to first, but it will if we've done something mechanically wrong, like done repetition, or like building with repetition. And at the same time, going back in and making some adjustments to a few of these figures, because I realized that as we move over to the right hand side, there's a little more light over there, and by lightening the values over there, it helps stay uniform with the light source. Now these little balconies in there help unify the windows or group them all up to each other, which is a good thing for that particular space. That way that building doesn't feel so mechanical. And then going around those windows with a slightly lighter value helps push back some of that information into the distance, as well as adding some blue hues to those particular spaces as I'm doing here. Then I'm coming back in and I'm going to do these wires that cut across from one side to the other. That's the last thing to put in. You don't want to be building your picture around those little details, because they aren't really significant by nature. They're just an added detail to help show scale, and in some cases to help show elevation. And it does unify the left side to the right side a little bit more. Now with the very last moment here, I decided to go back into a couple of these figures and push just a little bit more warmth into them so that they all kind of unify together. It seemed a little too dark all the way in the background, and by adding a couple more variations in value, and in this case in temperature, it helped create a little bit more spontaneity in the space and a little more noise that drops your eye into that space first and lets you kind of enjoy being on the ground plane with all these other figures before we get lost in the atmosphere of the picture.